Today we're talking about Donnie Brasco, the film, and a little bit about the book as well. And I want to emphasize at the beginning of my introduction, which will be followed by a sequence as we did the last time, how the two most important features in the film are the following. One, in line with what we've seen happening in other gangster movies, we see the criminal in a more familiar or domestic environment, right? We have Donnie Brasco, the undercover FBI agent, who is taking us into the world of mafia criminals and into their private lives. Not just into their criminal activities, and in fact, when you read the book, you might be disappointed by the lack of drama, by the limited number of crimes, of criminal operations, but by how slowly these small operations are set up. And keep in mind, because this gives you a good measure of our own assumptions about the power of criminal organizations, that the FBI itself ran this cover-up operation very cheaply with less than $100,000, which went into paying for some of the things that Donnie Brasco pretended to be doing for the mafia, some of the gifts he gave Lefty and others. But this gives you a sense, even though, of course, 100,000 or 50,000 during the 1970s and 80s were a bigger sum than it is today, multiplied by 5, let's say, and you have $250,000 from $50,000. Yet, it gives you a sense that it doesn't take much money to attract the attention of mafia criminals, not at the highest level, but from the middle level down. So, especially in the sequence I want to show you today, we'll see Lefty in his house, in his apartment with his family. We'll see him, of course, preparing dinner for Donnie, acting almost in a fatherly fashion, because part of Donnie's profile, made-up profile, is that he has no family, because that's easier to deal with. So he says that he was an orphan, grew up with no family, and there are less stories to make up and to be potentially verified. At the same time, another interesting quality and theme of this film is the fact that this criminal organization, if you look closely, if you look beyond the way they talk, the way they dress, their occasional crimes, the mentality and the practices almost reflect what would happen in a corporate or in any corporate organization. Now, this time there is no visual commitment to this model in the same way that we found in St. Valentine's Day Massacre from 1967 or The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2, with the long corporate tables, with the meetings, with the formal suits of the people gathering around those tables. So everything is informal, but the way they talk about their job is not very different from the way employees in any number of organizations talk about their job. And the final concept is the concept that you see highlighted in this part of the notes that I posted under week 13. Because it's easy to get confused, because a lot of time the language used in the book or in the film betrays a misunderstanding between two concepts that are similar but vastly different. And those concepts are authority and power. So overall, a mafia organization works through a geographical distribution of power that mimics what was going on with feudalism during the Middle Ages in places such as Italy or Spain, in other parts of the world, because feudalism is a social political model. You find it in Japan until the 19th century, for example. Under feudalism, when a government cannot be represented everywhere, they cannot place branches of governmental powers, offices, local bases throughout a territory, they simply divvy up this territory and assign absolute power over a small parcel of land to a baron, a duke, a marquis in the traditional aristocratic system, a shogun in Japan, etc. And this person has to organize the territory and send up the pyramid of power of the hierarchy, send up money or material goods and, more importantly, whenever needed, soldiers. And as long as they do that, they're fine. And as long as there is enough order within the small territory they control, they're not going to be bothered by whoever is higher than them. In the feudal structure, as well as in a pyramid made by the mafia, constructed by the mafia, there is a strong personal relationship, right? I picked you, I gave you, I'm in power and I gave you this territory because I trust you, you are my man. The language doesn't change much. For example, the word homage comes from the French homage, and it goes back exactly to this historical period, the Middle Ages, and this kind of structure. So homage is the relationship of respect that is born and created and maintained between two people at different levels in the hierarchy of power. So what the mafia will do, what a family, one of the 5 families controlling New York would do in the past, is give someone control over a territory. So someone might have control over Brooklyn, and then Brooklyn would be subdivided into smaller parts, right? And those parts could be divided to the level of a few blocks, as we saw in A Bronx Tale. But that, when you receive, when you're appointed capo, when you become the chief operator in a territory, this only means that the mafia organization has given you authority over that territory, meaning that your authority over that district is considered legitimate, and other members of the same family and possibly other families around should not be intruding into your territory. But then it's up to you as a local capo to get organized and put in place a system of power and actually control the territory over which you were given authority. Authority just means that your power, however you deploy it, is legitimate, is not going to be questioned, and it's not going to be attacked until such a time when it might be under attack, because of course periods of times alternate with periods of war within those organizations. But it's up to the local leadership to get enough power to control the territory. And one thing that is clear in the film is that people such as Lefty and his crew, the people above Lefty such as Sonny Red and Sonny Black, have only partial control over the territories assigned to them. Another example of this model of power comes in the film when Donnie invites Lefty and then Sonny Black to operate a nightclub in Florida. And they make an effort. First, they think that it might be possible to operate under the mafia radar, not to declare that they're part owners of that nightclub, but eventually they decide that they need permission from Santo Trafficante, who's one of the old guys the mafia had in Florida, clearly in exchange for respect and some kind of fee. But you see that this group of criminals is not very successful. They're not completely able to protect themselves. They're not completely able to be self-sufficient financially. They struggle sending up the money. We saw a scene on Tuesday where Sonny Black was talking about the money they needed and ways to gather the money, because every month he has to send $50,000 to Rusty, the person above him, and it's a constant struggle, right? So we see at some point that this guy, Sonny Black, got the power. This is the language used in the film, got apt, got Brooklyn, but in fact it's not even Brooklyn. Brooklyn, it's an exaggeration. He has no control over all of Brooklyn by a long shot. But even though the language seems to be mafia language, the reality, the concepts behind that language are the same concepts that you would find in any kind of career, right? He got promoted, essentially. And if Sonny Black got promoted, it means that other people in the organization were ignored. And therefore, there will be people like Lefty saying, oh my God, I killed 26 people, I worked my butt off for 30 years for this organization, and they didn't pick me. I was not promoted, right? So, even if Sonny Black has the authority, the power of his group has to be enforced locally. A system has to be put in place, and Sonny Black is not able to do that successfully, systematically, comprehensively. Is not able to raise the capital, the resources, to deploy a lot of soldiers and have a control that spreads over his area of Brooklyn. Okay, so don't be taken by all the legends about the mafia. It doesn't always work. There are some mafia leaders that were able to make millions, others that struggle to pay their fee to be set up in the organization, right? And I've already said that. What's interesting, what makes this less of a feudal pyramid and more of a modern organization is that since Donnie is connected to Lefty, Lefty is the made man, Donnie is the connected guy, somebody working for a soldier. Lefty insists at several times in the book and the film that he will be responsible if Donnie does something wrong, if Donnie violates the rules, if Donnie messes up an operation, okay? So it shouldn't be the case. You would expect that if Donnie does something wrong, he'll just be eliminated. But within the system, whoever vouched for him becomes exposed to the repercussions. And in many ways, this is also what would happen in several organizations run by civilians. As I said earlier, in the sequences, we'll see the domestic representation of Lefty and other criminals, but especially Lefty. We'll see Lefty dressed up not as a fancy mafioso at home, but more in the same way that you would see James Gandolfini in The Soprano dress at home, in a more casual, more comfortable way. We'll see a series of short scenes that happen in the film at the beginning and then throughout the film. One of the things that gives this sense of domesticity is the fact that oftentimes the TV is on, it's an old TV, clearly, and it's always on a channel showing documentaries with wild animals in Africa, because Lefty had this passion for those animals. But again, you see the private, the more personal side of this criminal. So there is more emphasis on this aspect than the 26 murders allegedly committed by Lefty. You only see Lefty killing someone once in the film, and in fact that is fiction. It is not even in the book, because Lefty did not kill those 3 couples. But they needed to have some drama, right? They needed to sell tickets. At the office, of course, we'll see him talking about food, preparing food, criticizing other mafiosi for sticking to Italian cuisine and preparing the same dish over and over, whereas we'll see Lefty preparing a French dish, coq au vin. We'll see his partner and then wife, although that character is not really well developed. It didn't need to be fully developed, but it's really almost like an extra. We'll see his son Tommy, who in the film and in real life was an addict, someone with a serious drug addiction problem. And in line with what I was saying about this representation of the mafia organization as an organization, period, anywhere you will find it in the commercial world, you find a lot. Once you decode the language, the surface, the appearance of the language, you find that they're talking about career. They're talking about the connection between results and rewards. Am I being rewarded well enough for the results I produced during my career in the mafia? Right? But that's the way they put it once you unpack the language. And of course, being upped, being made a capo, etc., is like talking about promotions, really. And this is one of the sentences you hear from Lefty: 30 years passing my hump. Al Pacino, that's my Al Pacino imitation, right? Or they passed me by, right? They ignored me, they didn't acknowledge everything I did for them. At some point there is another famous dialogue, I don't remember if it is part of the sequence, I'll show you, where Lefty is complaining that when Sonny Black was in prison, Lefty had to took care of Sonny's wife, mistress, and second mistress, right? Because he said he had a mistress to the mistress, and he had to pay 200 fazou, and I quote from. So, and in spite of that, he's saying, the implication of his remarks are, where is the fair reward for everything I did for these guys? Right? And more than anything, one realistic aspect of this film, especially based on what we know from the whole Gotti investigation, is how much time these guys spend talking about their job. Even when later on in a scene that I will not show you, Tommy is taken to a hospital because of an overdose. And Donnie goes to visit Lefty, who's outside his son's hospital bedroom. And Lefty says, same as 20 years ago, meaning he's talking about Tommy. Tommy was born 28 years earlier in a hospital, and as a baby, he was powerless. And now he's saying 28 years later, Tommy is in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, powerless as well. And this is about Lefty's personal life, but it seems that Lefty doesn't feel that he was successful in anything. Not as a father, not as a mafioso, that his career did not produce the results he was expected, right? So, in a way, you forget about the fact that he's a criminal, because his complaint, once you remove the language of a mafioso criminal, is similar to the language of many a father or a mother, right? So, at some point, when they're in Florida, Lefty and Donnie organize this boat ride because they know that Santo Trafficante, the old mafioso who lives there, loves boats. And so they invite Santo. The FBI provides this 100-foot boat that you saw on Tuesday in this article shown by Lefty to Donnie Brasco, saying, well, look, this is an FBI boat and we were on it, so what's going on? But there is disappointment in here as well, because finally, after waiting for a long time, they have the boat, they've scheduled the arrival of this Pezze 90, right? This big level, top level mafioso, Santo. But when Lefty, Al Pacino, goes to greet Santo and treats him as you would treat a baseball player, basketball player, saying, oh, I've dreamt all my life of meeting someone like you, right? Someone who's extraordinary in his profession like you. And Santo gets back to him saying, where is Sonny? Because he's there to meet with Sonny Black and do business with Sonny Black, because he knows that Lefty is irrelevant for the organization. And Lefty really takes it personally. And we see him in the film dejected on the boat, really feeling the brunt of the disappointment. Then, to make the situation even worse for Lefty, Sonny snatches Donnie from him, because between the two of them, in Sonny's mind, the couple's mind, Donnie is the best element of the organization. And it's Donnie he wants by his side more than Lefty, right? And then Sonny will say, I'll represent you, right? He will say that to Donnie, you belong to me, without asking for Lefty's permission, or even without showing that he's thankful, grateful to Lefty for bringing such a brilliant element as Donnie into the organization, right? And again, put this into perspective, the real Lefty, Benjamin Ruggiero, was really a character, and in many ways a disagreeable one. So even his fellow mafiosi, he was respected, I mean, but didn't have so many true friends, right? And then there is another occasion where Lefty is passed up, is ignored by Sonny, because Sonny introduces Donnie to Santo, the big Pezze 90, by saying, this is Donnie, he's a friend of ours, which is not even appropriate language, because friend of ours should be used for a made guy, and Donnie's not a made guy. But that's how high he ranks in the consideration of his capo, Sonny Black, right? Whereas Lefty is never receiving such compliments. It seems like Lefty is only being tolerated. That is an old guy, right? That people feel they have to keep around because he's done a lot, but they don't really think he's the best element in their organization. Of course, another element of disappointment is the fact that they're always worried about something. They're not really powerful enough. And then there is a powerful dialogue by Al Pacino doing Lefty, saying at some point, there is this existential crisis, almost saying, who the fuck am I? Meaning, I haven't achieved any kind of status that I would dream to get to. And then he says, I'm a spoke on the wheel, and then he adds that even Donnie or Nicky, who will be killed at the end, are like that. Meaning, I'm just part of this big organization and have no power. But again, take the mafia element out, put any kind of organization, IBM, Apple, Chase Bank, and these dialogues are still meaningful, right? The film is trying to emphasize, and it's a stretch, but traditional films are based on elements of symmetry, on symmetrical patterns. Because if you have a symmetrical pattern, then one pattern amplifies the other. And so they're trying to suggest that Donnie and Lefty get close because there are so many things that are similar going on in their lives. So Maggie will say that the FBI used my husband and sucked him dry. So it's not Donnie directly, but Maggie is complaining the same way that Lefty is complaining about the organization. And Donnie, Joe Pistone, will acknowledge this job is eating me alive, right? Meaning I cannot be a husband or a father anymore, and all of my life is spent in the service of this job. We see a scene where Donnie is called at the end, when he's left his role with the mafia, called at the headquarters. The director of the FBI gives a brief speech, but a very rushed speech. Someone comes in and says, 30 seconds, meaning that they have to go to another meeting. He reads this piece of paper very quickly. They give a check for $500 and a medal to Donnie, and that's it for almost 10 years spent away from his family, risking his life, really, almost on a daily basis. And then Maggie comes in to comfort him, his wife. It's over. Come on, Annie, come home. Meaning at this point you can have a regular life. And he tried. And if there is time, I want to show you a few minutes of the real Pistone, who's still alive. Of course, still hiding, but sometimes he attends public events, so he feels comfortable enough. He thinks, evidently, that the $500,000 prize put on his head is not being sought any longer. In this film, as we found in Godfather 2, other films, you have this idea of the possibility or the dream of an alternative life outside of the mafia, right? Lefty himself says, I wish I had that boat. He's talking about a boat called the Bertram that he had when he was younger, a fishing boat, and the days without a care, without much care that he spent, the hours or days he spent on that boat, and he keeps reminiscing. Of course, he had to sell the boat because or give the boat to a loan shark, because Lefty is always without money, but he's still dreaming of getting out, being a free agent, meaning having some kind of criminal hustle, but not without the risks and the tension. For example, when Donnie with the FBI comes up with the idea that these mafiosi should become part owner of this nightclub in Florida, because then they want to collect evidence on them, this place called King's Court. Lefty, his first reaction is, well, I could keep this. Maybe I won't say anything to Sonny or anybody else, and this will be a nice side business that will generate thousands or tens of thousands of dollars every week. And so I'll be settled, right? I'll have some stability. And to the end, Lefty talks about, in the film, talks about this boat disappearing with a net. And we saw a sequence on Tuesday where it seems like Donnie, who has retrieved this bag with $300,000, would very much like for Lefty to take the money so that he can avoid arrest. And Donnie, if you read the book, was not as worried about arrest as he was worried about the consequences when he would be revealed to be an FBI agent. He was worried that Lefty would be killed, because Lefty brought him into the organization. And this didn't happen. Possibly the FBI saved later on Lefty's life. Lefty, of course, went to prison, spent 12 years in prison, came out, was paroled simply because he was sick with cancer and died just 6 months or so after he left prison, right? And Donnie tells him, you could leave this life, right? So it seems like in every film you have this theme. The other side of the domestic representation of the criminal is the fact that there is very little or no heroism. A very telling scene is when you see Lefty working a parking meter. He has the parking meter on a table and he's working it with a hammer, but he's hammering and hammering, really working a sweat to get coins out of the parking meter. So this is the level of this mafia operation, right? They're stealing change from kids, almost. They themselves acknowledge that they have a lot of small scams going, but nothing major, not even at the level of Goodfellas. At some point, as you saw on Tuesday, somebody calls in and the news goes out to the social club where the others are. Well, there is a truck full of razors, meaning what can we do? And nobody knows what to do. Yeah, there is value, but what will you do with a truck full of razors? Meaning what, 50,000 razors, 100,000 razors? And the King's Court business itself is nothing. This nightclub was in real life as cheap as you saw it in the film. And you see Lefty often being treated like a very low-level subordinate or a valet. At some point, it's cold, but he has to wait for the couple to arrive, and so everyone is outside the social club because they have to gather and meet the same way, in a similar way. You saw something similar in St. Valentine's Day Massacre with Al Capone. And we've seen the killing. It is dramatic, but you also see that they then spend a lot of time working the bodies, right? So it looks like it's not very heroic, it's hard work. Finally, a theme you should not forget about this film is information, because you find that, of course, the protagonist is there to collect evidence, right? Taping the conversations. He has to reconstruct the organization, which is not easy, because people will not tell you exactly what kind of authority another mafioso has. Information is compartmentalized. And, of course, in terms of information, both Lefty and Donnie are constantly trying to read the situation, analyze the situation, and understand what is going on, or understand if there is a risk they'll be killed themselves, right? So information is very important in the film. Very telling in the scene we saw on Tuesday when Donnie was initially left in the car, so he doesn't really know what is going on. He can guess that Sonny Red is being killed, but then they summon him into the basement, and there, of course, the film exaggerates that by having this guy almost pointing the gun at Donnie, but he's going in without knowing whether he'll be the next killed. And instead they put him there to cut the bodies, something that didn't happen in real life. The same is true for the very final scene where you have Lefty leaving his apartment because he got sent for. And he doesn't know what will happen to him. In fact, he's afraid they'll kill him, and before he leaves the apartment, he puts his watch, his pinky ring, the cash he carries in his pocket in a drawer, small drawer in the house for his wife, because he's afraid he won't come back. Then closes the drawer, then comes back to open the drawer so she'll see it and will understand. Of course, information means also being exposed, right? If the mafia has information about, understands who Donnie Brasco really is, then there will be repercussion. In general, you see here the mafia as a secret organization, right? Where even the people inside only know some things, and the things they know, they're not sure of, right? And whenever there is information, there is manipulation of that information, especially with power. When Nicky is killed, and allegedly he was killed because he's a rat, but Donnie is trying to explain that he wasn't a rat, he was not responsible. Lefty has this beautiful line, no, Nicky is a rat because Sonny said so, right? If the capo tells me something, I have to believe it. Okay, so let me, perhaps I'll start with Pistone and then go to the film. This video is linked on page 13 if you want to see more of it, and in fact it's a two-part conversation, and this is the old Joe Pistone, but imagine this is a conversation from 4 or 5 years ago, and Pistone was Donnie Brasco when he was much younger, in the 1970s, and up until 81. So when Joe Pistone was Donnie Brasco, he was 40 years younger than you see him here. So this is Donnie, this is Joe Pistone in conversation with a former mafioso by the name of Michael Franzese. Keep one thing in mind, you shouldn't believe 100% of what either guy is telling the other. They're also playing a game with each other. A plane of respect, mutual respect, but they're also deceiving each other.